Hello. In today's tutorial, we're going to be creating smoke and smoke trails. There are two ways of tackling smoke in motion graphics. One is to use 2D smoke if your scene doesn't require any 3D motion within the scene, and the other one is obviously creating 3D smoke. So the first one we're going to tackle is 2D smoke, and it's a fairly straightforward operation, and it will introduce us to a new filter called Particle Playground. And for the 3D, we're going to be using something called fractal noise. So let's get to it. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create me a new composition. This composition is 1280 by 720 square pixels, same set as with everything I've created before. I am going to give it a name though. I'm going to call this one 2D smoke, and that is because that is what we're going to be creating in this composition. 2D smoke. I'll click OK on those settings, and that's more than okay. Next, I am going to be dropping an image that I picked up from the web. This is an image I did a search for, a fire pit image online, and this is what came up. I can scale it down to fit on the screen a little bit better, and as you probably gathered by now, the smoke will be coming out of that fire pit, meaning the wood has been turned off and there's some smoke coming out of it. So with this setup, what I'm going to do now is I am going to create a solid, make sure that is my comp size, and then I'll click OK. This comp size, this solid, I'm sorry, I want to rename smoke because that is where I will have the smoke particles coming from. Now for 2D smoke, it's only a couple of filters, and it doesn't get too big, so this should be a fairly straightforward operation. Keeping the name solid, whatever you want to call it, it's fine, but I try to keep my projects organized in such a way that I can easily identify by name whatever it is that I'm trying to create. That's good practice. So let's go ahead and click OK, and there's my solid. Now up here, what I'm going to call in my effects and presets window, I am going to search for particle playground. This is the one I'm looking for. So let me go ahead and drop that into the solid, and if I screw up my video, you'll notice that I have this little fountain of red dots coming from the center of the screen. That is the canon, meaning the origin where all the particles are being created and shot from, and then we have a way of affecting the different colors and different particles that are coming out of it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to move my the position of that cannon roughly on top of those logs that I have inside the fire pit. So I'm going to move it on the x-axis to the left, and then I'm going to move it down on the y-axis roughly around there. It's a good position. It's sort of in the middle of the logs. And I'm going to increase the size of the barrel so that it covers a little bit more space. And I'm eyeballing these values, as you can see, even though once you find something that works for you, it's good practice to make note of those values, because you're probably going to be reusing them quite often. Now, what I want to do is I want to change the color of those particles from red to somewhat light gray, which is the usual color of smoke, especially during the daylight in a scene like this. It will change depending on what you're working with. And then I'll click OK. And then I want to come to the filter itself, and I am going to kill its gravity. I don't want any gravity. I want my particles to be going up. So if you notice, all particles seem to be shooting from the logs, and they just go up. Okay. Obviously, this looks nothing like smoke. I want to go ahead and increase the particle radius to about 3 or 4 to give them a little bit more visibility. And I want to increase the amount of particles per second to about, I want to say about 120 to 150. Let's use 150 for now. Now that seems like a lot of particles, and it is a lot of particles. But this is going to do the job pretty nicely, I think, once we're done with it. So the first thing I want to make notice of, take note, I want to pay attention to the amount of particles that I have on the screen and the way smoke works in the real world. If you look at smoke, it's really not a constant thing. It's sort of similar to fire if you look at it from a black and white perspective. The difference is that smoke is a lot slower in the motion. It's a lot smoother. It doesn't. The tongues of smoke tend to linger and stretch, while fire seems to be very fast and sort of attacking all the time. So what we want to do is we want to give that variance to the smoke. We achieve this by changing the amount of particles per second we produce and the direction in which the smoke is being produced. Obviously, smoke is a lot more affected by the direction of the wind than fire is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an expression that will give me some variability both in the smoke amount of particles and the direction in which they are moving. Notice that these two are very different values. The particles per second seem to be the amount of particles per second, and the direction seems to be degrees. However, we can create an expression that works for both very similarly as long as we understand what the expression or whatever it is that I am affecting through the expression. Actually, how does it work? How do those properties on the expression work? So let's go ahead. To create an expression, I am going to press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac, and I'm going to click on the stopwatch for whatever characteristic, whatever property I'm trying to change. In this case, is the particles per second. Let's start with that one. So if I click while pressing the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac, notice that my number turns into a red number. My window opens up for that particular property within the timeline, and it gives me an expression window where I can actually type up code. This code for After Effects is based on JavaScript, so it follows the same rules as JavaScript. There's a lot of guides out on the web for JavaScripting for AE, and quite honestly, it's not difficult, but it does take an understanding of how to code. And I know a lot of you really don't like coding, so we'll get into that in more detail during class. So for this time, I'm going to make sure that my text is highlighted as it is right now, and it's in blue. That's by default. By simply activating the expression, it gets highlighted. And I'll go ahead and replace that with wiggle, open parentheses. I want to wiggle once per second, and I want to give it the amount of particles that I want to change every second. So I originally had put 150. So I want to make sure that they go from 0 to 300. That means if it wiggles about 150 from the point of start, which is what I gave it, 150, then at some points randomly it would be producing any particles from 0 to 300. Let me go ahead and close that and put a semicolon at the end. Semicolon is not necessary if you only have one line of code, but it's good practice to put a semicolon just to close the statements that you're creating. So that is the expression we're going to use. We're implementing a wiggler that is going to be changing every second, and it's going to change about 150 particles per second. Okie dokie. The next thing I want to do is create the exact same or similar expression for the direction. I want to make sure that I change the direction by a certain amount of time. So I'm going to use the same wiggle expression. While pressing the Alt key again or the Option key on the Mac, I'll click on the stopwatch for direction. So that one opens up. And with that highlighted, I will go ahead and type wiggle. This time I want to wiggle once every second. So notice that the first number tells me the frequency of the wiggler, and then the second one tells me the magnitude. In this case, my magnitude is measuring degrees because I am working with direction. So that is from 0 to 360. I want to change this by about 20 degrees. So it gives me a little bit of variability from negative 20, to positive 20, since my original value, as you can see up here, and the filter is 0. So it's going to wiggle between negative 20 and positive 20. If you think about it that way, you have about a 40-degree angle where these particles will be shooting towards, and that gives me enough variability since they're all going up. It almost looks like a V, like they're coming out of a V shape. That will be the end result. So let me go ahead and close the parentheses and semicolon for it to take. Then I'll simply click anywhere else so that they activate. And if I scrub, you'll notice that my smoke sort of gets thin or it gets thick depending on whatever random values are being created by the wiggle, and the particles are also wiggling left and right, as you can see, due to the change in degrees based on the direction. So that is enough for the particles that we have created. Now what we have to do is fake these particles to look a little bit thinner and semi-transparent, and for that I am going to apply another filter, and we've used this one in the past. I'm going to use fast blur. Simply going to drop fast blur on top of that filter, and I'm going to increase it to about 40, and just by simply applying that I get fairly realistic smoke. Let me come in to fit a little bit more, and let me scrub that video. I'm going to create a short 2-second render of this, and you'll notice that we get fairly good smoke coming out of the fire pit. Now you'll notice that my rendering is rendering every other frame, and that's because I'm saving RAM by changing in my preview area to skipping every second keyframe. If I want a full render, then I'll remove that, make it 0, and then I get a smooth playback animation. Okay, so that looks pretty good, and that fits really well with the scene, colors and all. But that is a 2D solution. It's a flat solution. If at some point I had this to be a 3D environment and I wanted a camera to flow through it, I would need to solve it in a different way. And for that, I need to create smoke in a completely different way, where the particles are actually moving in 3D space and responding to the position of my camera. So that will be our next tutorial.